today's session, I'll be discussing about gaseous exchange. I'll also discuss about some of the parts from transport system or gaseous transport system. So, at the very beginning, we should know what is the main characteristic features that allows the gaseous molecule to exchange into different media. So the gaseous exchange are mainly explained by explaining the external gaseous exchange and internal gaseous exchange. The external gaseous exchange involves the exchange of gases between lung alveoli and blood. An internal exchange system involves the blood and tissue. So here, the exchange of gases basically depends on an important thing that is known as the pressure gradient. So, according to the law of diffusion, the gaseous molecules always moves from one side to another based on their concentration gradient. Here it is pressure gradient. According to the law of diffusion, the gaseous molecules always moves from higher pressure gradient to lower pressure gradient. Right? So here, in the exchange mechanism, we must know about the pressures of that particular gases in a particular medium. Right? What is the pressure in atmospheric air? What is the pressure of gases in lung alveoli? And also, we need to know what is the pressures in the lung capillary, as well as we also need to know about the pressure present in systemic circulatory system and tissue. Now, let me write something here. In the atmospheric air, the partial pressure of oxygen is around 159 mmHg in atmospheric air. This is called PO2 is 159 mmHg. And partial pressure of carbon dioxide is around 0.3 mmHg. Right? Here, if you see the pressure in the lung alveoli, it is little less above the PO2 in the lung alveoli. So what is the partial pressures of oxygen in lung alveoli? It is around 1.104 mmHg. Whereas in lung alveoli, partial pressure of carbon dioxide is around 40 mmHg. It means the inhaled air or pressure of inhaled air and pressure inside lung alveoli, there is a difference. Here PO2 is higher in outside in comparison to partial pressure of oxygen in alveoli. So according to the law of diffusion, obviously the oxygen will move from outside to inside, and it is due to pressure gradient, right? Now see, this is the capillary or pulmonary capillary, right? This part is pulmonary capillary. Now see, pulmonary circulation. If you see the pressure difference, PO2 is around 95 mmHg, right? And PCO2, it is around 40 mmHg. That is about the pressure inside PCO2. So here you can see, again there is a pressure difference. So here the air again will diffuse from alveoli, mainly the oxygen will diffuse from alveoli to the capillaries, and I'll explain when carbon dioxide will move from capillary to alveoli again. Now, this oxygen or the oxygen presence in the pulmonary system will move to the heart, right? Through the left atrium and to the left ventricle. So as we know, the left ventricle contains the oxygenated blood. The contractions of the left ventricles helps the ejections of this oxygenated blood through aorta into the tissue, right? I repeat, from this pulmonary system, it enters into the systemic circulation. So in the systemic circulation, it first enters into the left atrium. From left atrium, through bicuspid valve, it enters into the left ventricle. So during contractions of the left ventricle, the oxygen molecule ejects through aorta into the body circulation, so-called body tissue or body cells, which is required for the cellular respirations of each and every different type of cell. Right? Now, suppose this is the part this is left atrium, this is left ventricle. Here, from left ventricle, there is a mechanism or there is a system, so-called cellular system or tissue system, which needs the oxygen molecule. So, the contractions of the left ventricles leads to ejection of oxygenated blood that enters into the cell, and the cell needs the oxygen for cellular respiration or for metabolic activities. During cellular respiration, it not only uses the oxygen molecule, it also produces the waste material, that is carbon dioxide, right? That needs to remove from the cell, that needs to remove from the body. So what is the systems to remove this waste material? Here in the tissue, if you see the partial pressure of oxygen and partial pressure of carbon dioxide, again you will find sharp difference. Here the partial pressure of oxygen into the tissue is around 20 to 40 mmHg, right? But partial pressure of carbon dioxide in tissue is around 46 mmHg, right? So again, due to the pressure gradient or due to the pressure difference, this gaseous moves from the tissue to the pulmonary systems again, but before going into the pulmonary systems, it has to enter into the circulatory system first through superior or inferior vena cava. It enters into the right atrium. From right atrium through tricuspid valve, it enters into the right ventricle. We know there is a path for the release of carbon dioxide from right ventricle to the lungs. This is called pulmonary valve, right? So here, from the right ventricle, the oxygen, carbon dioxide molecules against will move to the pulmonary system, mainly into the lung, right? Now here, this is pulmonary vein. Pulmonary vein. Now, sorry, this is pulmonary artery actually. This is pulmonary vein because in the respiratory system, the arteries carries deoxygenated blood and vein carries oxygenated blood. So here this is the pulmonary artery that carries the deoxygenated blood, and again due to the pressure difference between this artery and the alveoli, the oxygen molecules return back to the alveoli to remove from the lungs. Here, if you see the pressure difference between this part and alveoli, you will find PCO2 is around 46, PO2 is around 40 mmHg. Here in alveoli, as I mentioned, the PCO2 is 40 and PO2 is 104. So again there is a pressure difference. Mainly partial pressure of carbon dioxide is little bit more here in comparison to alveoli. So carbon dioxide molecules move from this part, mainly from pulmonary capillaries to the lung alveoli. Ultimately, the expirations leads to the release of that vast material carbon dioxide. Right? It means the gaseous exchange totally depends on pressure gradient. So what are the other main factors that helps the diffusion process of this gaseous molecule? Not only the pressure gradient, obviously the solubility of the gas, the temperatures of the environment, right? These are two other important factors that allows the molecules in the diffusion process, right? Now during this gaseous exchange, we have seen here the exchange of both the oxygen molecule as well as the carbon dioxide molecule, which occurs in two sections. The first section was called external system, where exchange occurs between these and this, and this is another system where exchange occurs between the systemic circulations and the tissue. This part is called the internal exchange. This is external exchange, right? Here, during the transport, during the exchange process, there are various factors that affects that affects the binding capacity of oxygen molecules with the hemoglobin. As we know, the transport of gases basically occurs by two ways. Some of the oxygen molecules are transported in dissolving form, and most of the parts of the oxygens are transported by binding to the hemoglobin molecule. Now question is, what is the exact mechanisms of the binding of oxygens to the hemoglobin, and how it influence the release of that oxygens to the tissue. So to explain this oxygen transport, mainly in the binding form, mainly when oxygen binds to the hemoglobin, to explain this, we should explain about the saturation of hemoglobin or percent saturation of hemoglobin, which is denoted by SaO2, and we also need to know the partial pressure of oxygen, that is PO2, right? It means there is a relationship between the partial pressure of oxygen and the percent saturation of hemoglobin, which is explained by oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. If you see the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, you will find there are various factors that affects the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So before knowing about the different factors involved in oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, we must know what is the normal pattern of oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. It is also known as oxygen dissociation curve. In oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, as I mentioned, it explains the relationship between the partial pressure of oxygen molecule with the percent saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen molecule, right? The percent saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen molecules is denoted as SaO2, and partial pressure of oxygen is denoted by PO2, right? If you see the normal pattern in resting state, it is sigmoid in nature. It is sigmoid in nature. Here, in the x-axis, it is partial pressure of oxygen, and y-axis it is percent saturation of hemoglobin, right? At lung level, see here in the x-axis, the partial pressure here is 100, right? At this partial pressure, if you see the characteristics of the hemoglobin molecule, all the binding site of hemoglobin molecules, almost all the binding site of hemoglobin molecule is occupied by oxygen, right? So as we know, hemoglobin molecules contain the oxygen binding site, that is basically binds to the heme group. In a single molecule there is 4 heme group or 4 oxygen molecules can bind. So at this partial pressure of oxygen, almost all the hemoglobins are occupied by oxygen. It means In this partial pressure, the percent saturation of hemoglobin is around 99%, right? There is no free side in hemoglobin molecules for further binding of oxygen. Now here, one thing I should mention, what is an important factor that allows the oxygen molecules to bind with hemoglobin. At initial point of time, the binding of oxygens with hemoglobin is little bit difficult. Once fast molecules binds with one oxygen binding site, it alters the hemoglobin structure that facilitates the further binding of oxygens with the same hemoglobin molecule mainly in the site which remains free, right? This is called positive cooperativity, right? I repeat, initially the binding of oxygen with hemoglobin molecules is little difficult. Once the first oxygen molecule binds to the oxygen and binds to hemoglobin, it facilitates the further oxygen molecule binding with the same hemoglobin molecule, right? So here, at this partial pressure of oxygen, all the binding site of hemoglobin are occupied by oxygen, right? Now, as I mentioned, this oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve is the relationship between partial pressure of oxygen and percent saturation of hemoglobin. Now, if you see the curve, here it is called P50. What is P50? P50 means the 50% of the hemoglobin are occupied by oxygen. It's called 50% saturation. Now question is, as for the 100% saturation of hemoglobin, it needs the partial pressure of oxygen. Whether for the 50% saturation of hemoglobin, it needs the partial pressure of 50? No. So here, for 50% saturation of hemoglobin, it needs very less amount of partial pressure of oxygen. What does it mean? Whether it reflects the more affinity between oxygen and hemoglobin or less affinity between oxygen and hemoglobin. As P50 means 50% of the binding site are occupied by oxygen at a particular partial pressure. And even if you see 25 to 26 millimeter of mercury and 40 millimeter of mercury, both the partial pressure shows different saturation point. Around 70 to 75% of the hemoglobins are occupied by at this partial pressure of oxygen. But at this partial pressure of oxygen, only 50% of hemoglobins are saturated. So what does it mean? It means once blood comes to the systemic artery in the binding form, it needs to release those oxygen for the cellular respiration, right? The blood that comes to the systemic circulation, mainly the artery, due to the pressure gradient and even due to the demand of oxygen by a particular cell, it needs to release of those oxygen to the tissue. So, since there is a pressure gradient, there is a release of oxygen from hemoglobin to the tissue. So, to release those oxygen, It needs the dissociation of oxygen molecules from hemoglobin. See, this needs the dissociation of oxygen from hemoglobin. Here, this percent saturation of hemoglobin denotes the binding, the percentage of oxygen binding with hemoglobin. No? But here, to get the oxygen by a particular cell, the oxygen molecule needs to dissociate from the hemoglobin. So if there is a dissociation of oxygen molecule from hemoglobin, it means there is a changes in the SaO2, because it denotes the percent saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. But due to the release of oxygen from here to the tissue, there is a dissociation of oxygen molecule from hemoglobin molecule. It ultimately leads to the decrease of percent saturation of hemoglobin. So here at tissue level, if you see, the partial pressure is less, or partial pressure of oxygen is less, right? The partial pressure of oxygen is less, at the same time, the percent saturation of hemoglobin is also less, right? So here, as I mentioned, there are some factors that influence the dissociation of those hemoglobin molecule, that influence the percent saturation of hemoglobin molecule. So what are those factors? The most important factors is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, or PCO2, right? Then H plus ion concentration, right? Again, temperature, bis-phosphoglycerate. It is an intermediate product of glycolytic pathway. So here, these factors influence the relationship between partial pressure of oxygen and percent saturation of hemoglobin. So how it influences? If you see the curve, it influences in two different ways. With the increase of those factors, the curve shifted towards the right side, right? If there is an increase in partial pressure of carbon dioxide, H plus ion, that is decrease in the pH, it is also known as acidosis, and increase in temperature and increase in 2,3 BPJ level alters the normal sigmoid shape. It shifted towards the right side. Now question is, when it shifted to right side, it changes the percent saturation of hemoglobin or not? Right? See, in the normal condition, at this particular pressure, the saturation was almost 100%. But now it is not 100%. It is around 75% like this. Right? So here, if you see the point P50 here, initially P50 was this. Now P50 is increase or decrease? So P50, if it is shifted to right side, P50 also changes, right? As I mentioned, these are the factors that alters the sigmoid pattern. It is shifted towards the right side. Now, my question is whether due to increase of all those factors, whether oxygen molecule dissociates from the hemoglobin or associates or binding to the hemoglobin. Association or dissociation. If it is dissociation, so due to dissociation, where oxygen molecules goes? Or if it is association, how it causes the changes in the affinity? See, initially it was 26 for P50. Now changes the condition. Concentration of carbon dioxide is more here. Means the number of oxygen molecule is less. Means oxygen molecules is dissociates from hemoglobin that enters into the tissue. The same graph, if you compare with the next one, with the changes in this particular factor, how it affects. Here, due to the decrease in TCO2, H plus ion and temperature 2-3 bpg, it is shifted towards the left side. Right? So shifted towards the left side, it indicates whether affinity between oxygen and hemoglobin will increase or decrease. If there is a decrease in this particular factor, whether this causes the increase or decrease in the affinity of hemoglobins with oxygen. Just look into the graph. Just compare with the normal one. If you look the P50 for normal one, and now the last one, the P50 or partial pressures to get the P50 with this particular conditions is little less. It means partial pressure less. So here, the bound form of oxygen molecule, whether the sufficient amount of oxygen molecules will enter into the cells or tissues depends on the pressure gradient or partial pressures alone. There are several factors. That factors either positively means increasing the affinity between these two, hemoglobin oxygen, or negatively means decreasing the affinity between oxygen and hemoglobins as influenced by this one. So this is what is the oxygen dissociation curve. This is what is the relationship between the partial pressure of oxygen and partial saturation of hemoglobin.